Could I welcome everyone to this CILIP Informal and our talk tonight. I'm Jill Swales, I'm one of the CILIP committee members. I live in Scotland, and I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, who also lives in Scotland, Professor Ian Johnson, to give our talk tonight, which is Library Development in Iraq, Rewriting History. Since visiting Baghdad in 1981, Ian's been investigating the gap between what we thought we knew about the development of libraries and librarianship in Iraq and the realities. This presentation is based on continual contact with Iraqi colleagues since that visit and an in-depth exploration of published information. We're going to have some time, I think, at the end for some questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, if you could put it in the chat, and it would be great if you could mute yourselves during the talk. So I'm delighted to hand over to Ian. Thanks very much.
Well, good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon. And let me begin by thanking CILIP's International Group for inviting me to make this presentation, and thank you all for taking an interest in the subject. What I want to do today is first briefly explain how my interest in libraries in Iraq began, and what I've been trying to do, gather and share information about their development. I'm not going to take you through the history of library development in Iraq. In the time available this afternoon, that could only be covered in a rather superficial and probably tedious way. What I'm going to try to do is focus on a few things that were previously not well known outside Iraq, some that are still possibly not well known in Iraq, and some that still need to be explored. The aim is to illustrate that there have been some things that we thought we knew but didn't, and there are some issues that we had not previously recognized. These we now have to treat, to use a familiar phrase in the Iraqi context, as known unknowns. By recognizing them and looking for information about them in the right places, they might become a little better understood, and so might the history of libraries in Iraq. So, how did my interest in Iraq begin? In 1981, that's going back quite a long time now, the head of the School of Librarianship at Al-Mustansiriya University in Baghdad wrote to the College of Librarianship, Wales, asking for help in motivating his students. He wanted them provided with an opportunity to see and experience examples of modern librarianship that it was not possible for them to see in most libraries in Iraq. Frank Hogg, the principal of CLW, College of Librarianship Wales, sometimes called CLU. Frank, who sadly died a few weeks ago, was away on long-term leave in Canada, reorganizing a library service there. Organizing internships and study tours for CLU students was part of my department's job. Don Mason, who was acting principal at the time, suggested to the British Council that as part of a longer tour around the Eastern Mediterranean that I was about to undertake to discuss some other projects, I should go to Baghdad to discuss what was needed and how CLU might be able to help. The council kindly agreed to provide the funds for the whole of my tour, and I was accommodated in Baghdad in the house of the council's representative in Iraq, which happened to be right next door to the university I was visiting. Getting a visa to get into a country whose president, Saddam Hussein, was increasingly paranoid about foreign interference, and being in Iraq when it was at war with Iran, as it was throughout most of the 1980s, are a story for another day. Except to say that I was warmly received by the staff of the School of Librarianship and remain in touch with several of them to this day. From this afternoon's perspective, what matters is what I discovered about libraries and librarianship while I was there. I'd hurriedly done some reading before I set off, and that led me to believe that there were in fact two schools of librarianship in Baghdad. a part-time 6-month postgraduate course in the University of Baghdad, and a full-time undergraduate course in the university I was to visit. Both appeared to have small numbers of students and were taught by a small number of part-time teachers. When I arrived, I found that they'd been merged into a single school with a large number of students, a full-time postgraduate course as well as a full-time undergraduate course, and a large number of full-time, well-qualified teachers. Why and how that had happened were questions that immediately came to my mind. You could say that that was the first of the known unknowns that I encountered. The proposal that we put together for Iraqi students to come to Britain made no progress. The Iraqi government's funding priorities during their wartime economy didn't allow for things like that. Later, Iraq became even more isolated, particularly after the invasion of Kuwait, when it was subject to the United Nations embargo. After the overthrow of Saddam's regime in 2003, I began gathering information about the real and alleged damage to Iraqi libraries and archives during the invasion and the civil disorder that followed. That led me to wonder what had existed before the invasion. I was fortunate that an American colleague heard about this and she'd secured some fundings from an American agency for a series of meetings with the teachers from the School of Librarianship at Almuston Syria University to brief them on the developments that they'd missed during the previous 20 years. I was invited to participate in those meetings, which took place in Jordan and the Emirates, where I heard more about the quite striking progress that had been made despite the difficult circumstances. My visit to Baghdad and continuing exposure to librarianship throughout the world had stimulated a growing interest in the range of factors that influence development. Perhaps I can take the liberty of reminding you that libraries do not exist in isolation. They're shaped by a context that includes not only the needs of their users, but the overall state of the economy, government priorities, as we encountered in Baghdad, levels of literacy and education, the social and economic infrastructure, the state of the publishing industry, and of course, events and differences that they can make. I regret to say that many researchers in our field, as much as in any other, have a tendency to suffer from what has been described as tunnel vision. They focus on the texts and methodologies that have dominated the literature of their own specialism. But I knew that I needed to look more widely at a broad range of factors that included not only the internal circumstances of Iraq, which I've outlined, but also the external influences on development in Iraq. So I had to look at a range of international governmental and professional bodies and how they shaped support for library development. To identify what seemed to contribute effectively, I also decided to look at what seemed to work across the broader information sector, particularly archives and records management, not only in Iraq, but also to a certain extent in other Arab states, which was subject to the same guidance and approach. I began gathering material for this study before I left CLU in 1989, but it's really only since I retired that I've had time for what has proved to be a bigger task than I expected. So what can I tell you? What examples can I put in front of you? I began my study by looking at the early history of writing, publishing, archives and libraries in the Middle East, the cradle of civilization, some people have called it, partly to understand how development began there, but also to be able to recognize the origins of any traditional practices and attitudes that I might find lingering in contemporary Iraq. What I found was that most of the popular histories by Western authors that cover the early development of libraries in the region focus on the Assyrian Empire and the Arab Caliphate, but seem to have not kept abreast of recently published scholarship, even in those fields. Most, for example, still widely assert that the Mongol capture of Baghdad in 1258 AD resulted in the destruction of the large libraries founded by the Arab rulers and plunged Iraq into a cultural dark age. But scholars now working in the field have been carefully rereading the ancient texts. They found confirmation that some of those famous libraries continued to function 100 years or more later. They've also demonstrated that many similar but smaller foundations were made that came into existence during the periods of Mongol and Ottoman rule. So the history of that period needs to be generally corrected. But the history of the early period also pointed to another known unknown. During this early period, archivists and librarians were among the elite of society. Their status in Iraqi society has declined since then. Why has that happened? What can we learn from that? Let me turn next to the foundation of the first significant library to be established in the 20th century in Iraq, the Maktabat al-Salam, which translates as roughly the Peace Library. This was a subscription library that later became known as the Baghdad Public Library, and in time became the basis on which the National Library was founded. In the civil administration that the British sent into Iraq, initially during the period when the country was being occupied, after the outbreak of war in 1914, and troops from British India moved into Iraq, gradually overtook the whole country. One of the most famous in that civil administration was Gertrude Bell, the explorer, known also as an archaeologist. She's been the subject of many biographies produced by Western writers, all of which repeat a claim that she had founded a library in Baghdad, which later became the National Library. They all seem to have not read Miss Bell's published correspondence carefully. One of her letters to her father noted that, in fact, the idea for the Maktabat al-Salam had actually been originated by a Mrs. Forbes. She was said to be the wife of a judicial officer in the civil administration, but she's never mentioned anywhere else again. She seems to have had quite an interesting background. But why did Miss Bell not mention her again? And what might have influenced Muriel Forbes, to take this initiative to try to start a library in Baghdad? That's an unknown that I'm also working on solving. Gertrude Bell's Western biographers also seem to have ignored the possibility that the early history of that library and others might have been written about in Arabic. I don't read Arabic, but some Iraqi contacts have drawn my attention to various reports in Iraqi publications. And information can also be found in English in seemingly unlikely places. A paper about the women's movement in Iraq that came to my attention earlier this year was initially a matter of interest to me because it described the evolution of Iraqi newspapers and magazines, particularly those published by and for women. But it also mentioned in passing that someone called Ernest Norton became president of the library committee at Maktabat al-Salam after Mr. and Mrs. Forbes left Iraq, when he went back to India. And that report cited an early Arabic journal as its source of information. So someone found it. One of Gertrude Bell's letters, written in May 1921 to her father, does mention that they had met Norton and his wife on a journey from Basra to Baghdad. And she mentioned it because she'd just been to the funeral of his wife. A month later, when she was elected president, why did she not mention that she had been Ernest Norton's successor? There's something about Gertrude Bell that needed to be explored. I announced the identity of Mrs. Forbes at a conference about Gertrude Bell a few years ago. At that event, another presentation was about a documentary film about Miss Bell that was then in preparation. Sometime later, I noticed that the documentary had been completed and was to be shown on TV. As I watched it that evening, I suddenly saw a couple of scenes from an old War Office film which showed soldiers emerging from a so-called station library in Baghdad. I knew that before the First World War, Mrs. Forbes had lived in India. She would certainly have been familiar with the so-called station libraries, which were founded throughout India, wherever there were groups of British residents or military posts with troops posted. That led me on to the identification of the many libraries that were established by the British and Indian troops, or for the British and Indian troops, who were serving in Mesopotamia during the First World War, all of which seem to have been largely forgotten about for 100 years or more. Because the Maktabat al-Salam had run into financial difficulties, it was taken over by the state in 1924. That's when it became the Baghdad Public Library. Only one other public library in Mosul seems to have received any state support before the Second World War. But searching through the surviving issues of the English language newspapers published in Iraq in the 20th century, when they were digitized and released online a few years ago, I found that several more public libraries had in fact been existed. They were founded after the war by British residents in Iraq or by Iraqi citizens. Like the Maktabat al-Salam, they seem to have been subscription libraries. What happened to them is something that now has to fall into the category of being another known unknown, because at the moment there are gaps in the newspapers that are available online. After 1945, as Iraq's income from its oil wells began to increase, government funds for new public library buildings began to be allocated from time to time, as well as for new libraries for the colleges of the expanding university system, or university level system at that time. Every school had to have some kind of library provision. But all of these libraries, the public libraries, the university, the academic libraries, the school libraries, they can all be characterized in the same way. They had few books and few trained staff. The education system accounted for a third of all state spending in what appeared to be an increasingly wealthy oil-producing state, but teachers remained in short supply and remained not well trained. Teaching, up to, including university studies, was based on the use of textbooks specially compiled and published to support the curriculum. Only a very small number of books were independently published in Arabic, and very few of those were for children. The libraries seem to have been little used, except as quiet study spaces. Book provision changed little over the next 30 years. In time, Iraq began to rival the Lebanon and Egypt as one of the major centers for Arabic publishing. But until that began to happen, the development of a local publishing industry was largely neglected by the local Iraqi government, and the development of an international book trade between the Arabic-speaking countries faced numerous obstacles, import duties being one, the exchange of information about what was available being another. However, the staffing situation in libraries did begin to change, albeit slowly. For example, I found that the Ministry of Education started a course for school librarians. International agencies funded overseas visits or short in-country training courses for individual staff of other Iraqi libraries. The major shift began when the Ford Foundation began to support the development of the libraries at the University of Baghdad, sending a substantial number to the USA for master's degrees in the late 1950s. The Foundation's support seems to have made a real difference compared with most international aid programs, which provide scholarships in librarianship for perhaps one or two people. The Ford Foundation also sent consultants to Iraq to develop the libraries in the university. When they were there, they were delivering staff training courses. And many of the people who had been sent to study overseas became their assistants, and eventually the faculty who taught the first postgraduate course when it began to be established in the 1960s. UNESCO also sent in several consultants to assist development. Since this is a presentation organised by a British Library Association, I want to stop for a moment, partly to talk about two of the notable consultants who were British, but also for another reason, which will emerge in a moment. One of these consultants was Ernest Saunders, a former member of the staff of Manchester Public Libraries and the British Council. He spent 2 years in Iraq, reorganising the libraries of the higher education colleges, which later in the 1950s were merged to form the University of Baghdad. He also provided some training for their staff and for public library managers. Despite being the first ever UNESCO consultant to undertake a long-term library development assignment in Iraq and later in Indonesia, he was little known, even amongst his contemporaries. Why was he not better known? Was it perhaps, I stick my tongue in my cheek and say, was it perhaps because he had not managed to pass the Library Association's registration examinations? On the other hand, Harold Bonney, the other British consultant, had passed the Library Association's examinations and was quite well known. He had worked for the Army Education Corps in the Middle East during the war, and then afterwards in Southampton and Gravesend, before settling in Australia. His main focus in Iraq was supposed to be the public libraries, but as happened to many early consultants in library development, he also became involved in developing the school and college libraries and others. Bonney has been criticised by, amongst others, if I remember rightly, one of the founding members of this group, for not writing reports on his activities in Iraq. It's true that many of them seem to have disappeared. But the problem probably lies in UNESCO's archiving practices, at least in the early years, which were not established on the same basis that I found in use when I spent a couple of years working in the Department of Education and Science. There, everything received went first into a central mailroom and into the relevant file before being circulated to the people who needed to see it. Instead, letters were created with multiple carbon copies to be sent to and from overseas and distributed to the various sections in Paris. No one in Paris seems to have been tasked with the responsibility for archiving them. So finding them is a bit of a paper trail. I was again fortunate that I made contact with one of Bonnie's descendants in Australia, who was able to give me copies of some of the missing reports, and I've passed those on to UNESCO. I suspect that the others may still survive somewhere in UNESCO archives, or perhaps in the Iraq archives. Finding them remains a challenge for somebody else. Iraq's national archives are also in disarray, because there have not been any trained archivists to organise them. A training centre for technician-level staff was established some years ago, but never prospered for a variety of reasons. It may now continue to exist as part of a further education college in Baghdad. The bureaucrats in the Ministry of Education, for some reasons that are not clear, rejected a proposal to establish an archives course that was made by the School of Librarianship in Al-Mustansiriya University, some of whose staff have been teaching in the archives technicians program. It's only in recent years that the history department in Baghdad University established a postgraduate course in archive studies, but it's not clear whether that's prospered. Something certainly needs to be done about the Iraqi archives. Let me illustrate that by talking about one particular development. Again, something involving someone from Britain. In the late 1950s, John Ferguson, who had been Deputy County Librarian of Shropshire, became the British Council's first librarian in Iraq. He commissioned plans for a national library building from a British architect, Robert Pierce Hubbard. The project was abandoned when the monarchy was overthrown by a revolution in 1958. The architect's own records were destroyed when he retired and his practice closed. There don't seem to be copies in the British Council archives. But amazing things do keep turning up in the Iraq National Archives. A few years ago, for example, a British Iraqi scholar who was helping to organise the archives found, quite by accident, a copy of the plans drawn up by Hubbard. Unfortunately, a model that is now known to have been made, and any photographs of it have not yet been found. But hopefully, as the archives are sorted out, they will be. All this came about, the proposal to help them build the library, because the British authorities, although some were sceptical, were trying to persuade the Iraqi government to meet part of the cost of the library by using what was known as the Anglo-Iraqi Trust Fund. This was a way of giving back to the Iraqis Iraqi government money that had been paid to the British government as compensation for damage to British property during a failed pro-German revolt in 1941. What happened to the Anglo-Iraqi Trust Fund is not clear from the archives. Eventually, the British may have provided the site on which the National Library building now stands, but the archives are not too clear about that, or at least the British archives. What is clear is that half the cost of the construction was met by the Gulbenkian Foundation, rather more than is reported in any published document in the English language. The Foundation's support for this and numerous other libraries in Iraq are evident from many files in the Foundation's archives in Portugal. But there are certainly other files that I didn't have time to look at during a visit I made, and somebody else is also welcome to have a look at those. Another mystery, which I didn't have time to pursue at the time when I was there, or since when I've been in touch with any of the Iraqi colleagues, and perhaps I should do so, is what were the origins of the undergraduate program in Al-Mustansiriya University? And how did its merger with the postgraduate course from the University of Baghdad come about? There was a rumour that the proposal to establish the undergraduate program was made by someone whose performance when teaching the postgraduate course had not been satisfactory and they'd been kicked out. More likely, it seems to be simply that the expansion of the university system and the need to diversify the range of vocational subjects that could be offered to the increasing number of students lay largely behind it. We do know that one UNESCO consultant seems to have recommended the authorities to make the postgraduate program a full-time course. And later, another seems to have recommended the merger of the two programs. But I'm still not clear whether those reports to the Iraqi authorities were simply used to add further support to the proposal for the merger, or were the deciding factor. I do know that the Iraqi authorities appear to have often been reluctant to accept foreign consultants' advice, unless the consultant was actually going to be there to implement it. But there may have been other factors in play. Iraq was, and possibly still is, a country where personal contacts were very important. There were quite evidently informal networks linking influential people in Iraq. One example is the former pupils of what was known as Baghdad College. This was one of the leading private schools in Baghdad from 1932 until the government closed all the private schools in 1969. Its alumni could be resembled to those of any of the major public schools, the private schools in Britain. Would members of that alumni network have played any part in the approval of the two programs and their merger? I don't know. A recent study has revealed how important the library was regarded by its students. And I can certainly point to one individual who was connected with both Al-Mustansiriya University's School of Librarianship and the library at Baghdad College. A little mystery that may be solved someday. I'll end this review with one last known unknown. As I reminded you, Iraq was increasingly isolated during the last 20 years of the last millennium. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, the sanctions imposed by the United Nations and the way the consequences were implemented by the Iraqi government impoverished much of the country's people and public services such as libraries. We know that, in general, libraries were starved of funds, importing books was difficult and generally unaffordable. Library staff could not survive on their highly devalued salaries. Access to computers and the internet was severely restricted. Some exceptions were made for institutions favoured by the government. But we have no detailed report of what happened. We do know that the School of Librarianship in Al-Mustansiriya University established a master's degree program and a PhD program during this period, probably taking advantage of the government's need to establish programs at these levels in all disciplines, and establish programs at these levels in all disciplines, because funding for studying overseas was severely curtailed. The outline of the course looks good, but what was the reality? Where did the staff and students obtain teaching materials to support work at their levels? Al-Mustansiriya University was finally able to gift to the School of Librarianship its own dedicated computer laboratory, a few weeks before the 2003 war between the Allies and Iraq. That computer lab was totally removed by the looters in the following weeks. But were there other instances of development taking place, and how were they achieved? These are a mystery which still remains to be solved. I can't claim to have discovered what it is that drives development. Although I've explored many of the areas that provided the context within which libraries developed in Iraq, there's still some major gaps in what I've been able to examine. One obvious area for future investigation by someone else is what is revealed about Iraq's libraries in the Arabic language literature, and particularly in Iraq's national archives when they're sufficiently well organized to be explored. My examination of what happened in other Arab states could do little more than point to differences without necessarily explaining them. Similarly, deep studies of library development in those states and other countries are needed for firm conclusions to be drawn. But I can point to some aspects of development that may prove to be significant. One factor seems to be the need for external support to be substantial and concentrated if it's to lay a strong foundation. That raises the question, how can the aid agencies be empowered to resist the political pressures that usually mean they spread their assistance as thinly as possible across many countries? Another factor seems to me to have been significant, and that is the role played by individuals in library development in Iraq. How can we find out more about them? What influenced them? What influence were they able to exert? And how were they able to do so? What made them so effective? And how can those aptitudes be transferred to succeeding generations to achieve continuing progress? Part of the answer to those questions seems to have been demonstrated by what some members of our profession achieved in Iraq. There, librarians seem to have practiced what Ken Jones, my old teacher of library management, described as creative subversion. Creative subversion is recognizing how to achieve your own objectives while appearing to satisfy your bosses. How can librarians develop a greater understanding of the current content in which their libraries exist? Develop the ability to recognize opportunities that it presents, and the willingness to take the risk to seize them. This afternoon, I couldn't possibly cover everything that I've written about, even though it sometimes seems that something new is still being brought to my attention almost every week. I intend to finish working on the book at the end of this year, get it published and get on with something else. I hope that you'll take time to read it when it appears. For now, thanks for your attention. Yeah, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating to hear about library development in the historical context and all the mystery and detective work that's involved. And I wonder now if there's any questions from anyone. I was actually going to ask, you mentioned that the status of librarians had once been quite high in Iraq and then had sort of deteriorated. Wondered what it was, what sort of status they have in society today.
Much the same status as they have in many other countries, including ours.
Yeah.
not particularly influential. But why that is for a complex range of reasons. In the very early days, reading and writing were skills that were limited to a very small number of society. So managing archives and library type collections was limited, and the people who tended to have those skills were drawn from the people who were the ruling classes. Over time, those skills have been dispersed. One of the great things about Islam as a religion was its propagation of learning the language and learning to read. And so that became a more common skill. Over time, access to information became more general, particularly after the introduction of printing, when books became more common, cheaper. So there have been many things which have downgraded the need for the elite to become involved, if you like. But it's a very complex issue. I wouldn't like to say that's the only reason for it. But I think we have to learn in this new situation how to be more influential, how to make things work for us more. Some would have it. I've worked for a few people who knew how to make things do it. I didn't learn necessarily as much as I might have wished. We won't go into that here, but the skills do exist amongst our community, but they're not as strong as they should be.
You mentioned the consultants that went over earlier to help Iraq. I think you said it was the 60s or 70s, was it? Ernest Saunders and Harold Bonney. I just wondered, were other Middle Eastern countries also helped in the same way? Do you know about that?
Oh yes, UNESCO consultants went into most countries in the Middle East with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of support behind them. Morocco, for example, for all sorts of reasons, was given a large amount of support, as Iraq was, to establish education programs in librarianship. But UNESCO never established in the Arab world, or never successfully established in the Arab world, a school a school of librarianship, which acted as a regional school, as it attempted to do in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and in Southeast Asia. I think UNESCO possibly sensed that the degree of cooperation between the Arab states was not strong. And certainly the training center for archivists is one that suffered from that. On the one hand, the lack of cooperation between the Arab states, and on the other, UNESCO's reluctance to invest in it. And eventually it just collapsed. So there again, there are places in the Arab world which did well, or in the Middle East which did well. But not all of them prospered quite as well. Iraq actually was one of the major centers for UNESCO's international assistance for many years. But the impact was slow to be effective. It was effective because there was a lot of other money going in, particularly the Ford Foundation's money, and the support from Gulbenkian. And the people who benefited from that directly became involved in spreading the message. But their students still encountered attitudes in educational institutions and quasi-educational institutions like the public libraries, where the reading culture was not established because of the use of textbooks. And there were all sorts of reasons for that.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. How do you see the disarray in Iraqi archives best being solved? Is there any sign of international help, or are the solutions local?
I think the solution now is probably in their own hands. It depends on how successful the postgraduate course in the University of Baghdad has been. And there's no information emerging about that, not in English anyway. The scale of the problem is huge, and it's going to take quite some time to sort it out. UNESCO did make some early efforts. They, for example, sent the director of the British National Archives to advise on the development of the National Archives building in Iraq. But it actually ended up not quite as he intended for all sorts of local reasons. And before that, they'd sent a Dutch scholar who probably made things work well, as well as he could. But he was not an archivist. He was just a specialist in Arabic literature. And there'd been some miscommunication between the Iraqi authorities and the UNESCO office in Iraq, which wasn't satisfactorily clarified before they lighted upon this particular man to go there and do his thing. And he was quite disappointed by how little he managed to achieve. Since then, UNESCO's particular efforts in the field of archives have been discontinued, the so-called RAMP program, Records and Archives Management Program, which flourished for about 10 years. And they had a specialist archives advisor within the relevant department in UNESCO who got things moving. Then, as often happens in these international organizations, political pressures on them shifted their focus. And quite frankly, with few exceptions, the leadership of the UNESCO department responsible for libraries and archives has not been up to the job. They've been political placemen, but not effective across UNESCO as a whole in integrating UNESCO library and archive activity with anything else that was going on in much bigger parts of UNESCO. And they had an opportunity once to become the center of thinking about the new information world of information technology and communication for the whole of United Nations. And they fluffed it. They didn't pursue it at all. And it was gradually buried quietly as if it had never actually been suggested.
We've got another question in the chat. Can you venture any thoughts on the future of libraries in Iraq?
I think there's a lot of good intention there, and there's a lot of physical infrastructure and potentially the country has money to do things again. But let's be frank, the country is still in a state of some disorder. And until it resolves the sort of political difficulties within the country, I suspect real progress in library development is going to be very slow.
Yeah, that's quite sad.
Mm.
Leslie's also asking, what do you think are the barriers to UK librarians going out to Iraq as consultants? And it's perhaps partly what you just made comments on.
It's still seemingly not a particularly safe country outside the Kurdish enclave in the north. The American colleagues who invited me to participate in their project 10 years ago, 15 years ago, have since been working with the libraries and School of Librarianship in Kurdish Iraq, in what you could call the safe zone. But I'm not aware of any consultants who have been in to the south, to Baghdad, in recent years. There have been some efforts in Basra through the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, BISI, to re-establish a library to support archaeologists in the country, taking over one of the old Saddam palaces in Basra and gifting to it the BISI collection, which was locked up in Iraq since BISI was thrown out of Iraq in the Troubles 20 years ago. But other than that, one hears nothing much.
I think that's the end of the questions that have been put in the chat just now. I was going to ask, have you got a title and publisher for your book?
I haven't got a publisher. A couple have been suggested to me, and I'll probably approach them at the beginning of next year when I've got the text complete, before I carry on doing the things like indexing and tidying up the bibliography. The title, yes, simply because of what it covers. It's going to be something like the development of the information sector in Iraq, because it's not just about libraries, it's about archives, it's about publishing, as well as the context in which they all existed.
You'll have to send the details to CILIP when it's published. We'd be fascinated to see it.
Yeah, the other thing I'm working on, which I was able to work on with digitized collections during the COVID pandemic, when libraries and archives were closed, which I hope to get back to next year, is the story of Mrs. Forbes, the lady who founded the Maktabat al-Salam. Her family is a fascinating one. She encountered libraries of different kinds in different countries. And I've got a large part of that already written because it's mostly historic material. I need some time, a few weeks at least, in libraries in London to close that one down.
Well, it sounds fascinating. Perhaps you could come and talk to us about that when you've finished your research. It's just drawing to 6 o'clock. So could I thank everybody for coming and their questions, and could I particularly thank you, Ian, for joining us. We've been a long time in planning this, and it's been fascinating to hear about your research. It's so wide-ranging, and it covers such a lot of different facets and aspects. I've really enjoyed it. So thanks very much. And before everyone goes, could I just mention we've got a course coming up the following 2 Mondays for half a day. If anyone would like to sign up at the last minute, there are still some places, and it's about writing bids and getting funding. The course will cover all aspects of that, so just like to promote that. So thanks again, everybody, and particularly to Ian for coming along. Hope the rain dries up soon.
So do I. Thank you for the invitation again. I hope the course on writing research proposals goes a long way. It can be hard work, but it's always rewarding when you get things moving.
We've got some thanks coming in the chat as well. I don't know if you can see them, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for waiting for me. To get the
Thanks, Ian. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Bye now.
Bye-bye.